A man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words at dinner in 3 years. A woman the whole town had decided didn't deserve to exist. And a 6-year-old boy who looked up at his father one afternoon and said 7 words that cracked the world open. "Papa, that lady looks really lonely." Colton Hayes should have kept walking. Every smart instinct he had told him to keep walking. Instead, he stopped. And in stopping, he set into motion a war that would cost him nearly everything he'd spent a lifetime building, push him and 15 desperate families into a mountain crossing that killed men stronger than him, and force him to decide what kind of man he actually was when the ground beneath his boots gave out completely. If you've ever been the person nobody stood up for, this one is for you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Dry Creek Valley, autumn 1882. The drought had been eating the valley for 2 years before it started eating the men who lived in it. Colton Hayes could feel it in the ground every morning when he walked from the barn back to the house. That particular dryness, like the earth itself, had given up sweating. The grass that had once grown thick along the creek bed was gone, replaced by cracked mud and pale dust that lifted on the wind and coated everything. The fence post, the water trough, the wooden cross he'd hammered into the ground behind the house 3 years ago and couldn't bring himself to look at anymore. He was 34 years old and he felt 60. He'd wake before dawn, dress in the dark, eat whatever was easiest, usually cold biscuits left from the night before, sometimes nothing at all, and be out working before Eli stirred. It wasn't that he didn't love his son. He did. Fiercely, quietly, in the hollow way a man loves something when loving it is the only thing standing between him and a complete collapse. But the mornings were hard. Mornings meant the house, and the house meant the kitchen, and the kitchen meant the chair where Margaret used to sit with her coffee and her small frown while she read. And Colton had learned that if he was already outside and sweating before that particular memory had a chance to find him, he could make it through another day. 3 years since she'd died. Fever. Fast and brutal, and no warning. Here 1 week, gone the next. The doctor in town had used words Colton didn't understand and couldn't remember now, even if he'd wanted to. All he remembered was the smell of that room and the sound Eli had made when they told him, and the way the ranch had felt afterward, like a clock that kept ticking even though no one was winding it anymore. He'd kept the cattle alive through will and stubbornness and very little else. 43 head down to 29. The summer had taken the rest. He had 2 ranch hands, brothers named Dale and Pete Greer, who worked cheaply enough that he could still afford them, though barely. They were decent workers when they were sober, which was roughly 2/3 of the time. It was Pete who mentioned the supply run. "We're near out of salt," he said one morning, leaning on a fence post with the particular boneless ease of a man who's already decided the workday is mostly over. "And the axle grease, and we're low on flour." "I know what we need," Colton said. "Just saying, need to make a trip before the week's out." "I know." He took Eli on the supply run because Eli hadn't left the ranch in 3 weeks and was starting to develop the slightly feral energy of a child who'd been talking to chickens too long. The boy sat beside him on the wagon bench with his boots swinging above the footboard, narrating everything he saw with the relentless commentary of a 6-year-old who had stored up approximately 10,000 observations and was now deploying them all at once. "That cloud looks like a boot." "Papa, do clouds feel anything?" "Don't think so." "How do you know?" Colton didn't answer that one. He was watching the road. Dry Creek was the kind of town that had been almost prosperous once and was now slowly forgetting what prosperous felt like. The main street had a trading post, a feed store, a saloon, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and maybe 24 other buildings that ranged from solid to barely standing. On a good day, it smelled like horses and sawdust. On a bad day, it smelled like everything else. He pulled up outside Harlan's trading post, set the brake, and climbed down. Eli scrambled after him, immediately distracted by a cat sleeping in the sun near the door. "Don't bother it," Colton said automatically, and pushed through into the dim interior. He spent 20 minutes working through his list with old Roy Harland, who'd been running the trading post for 30 years, and moved with the slow deliberateness of a man who understood that things would get done in their own time, and rushing was a young man's foolishness. While Roy tallied the goods and found what he had and didn't have, Colton stood at the counter and let his mind go quiet. He wasn't expecting anything from this day. He wasn't expecting anything from most days anymore. When he came back out, Eli wasn't where he'd left him. A small spike of alarm. Then he spotted the boy, maybe 30 feet down the boardwalk, standing completely still and staring at something with the focused intensity children reserve for things adults have stopped noticing. Colton walked over. "What are you doing? I told you to stay close." Eli didn't answer right away. He was looking at a bench against the trading post wall, just around the corner from the main entrance. A woman sat there alone. She had dark hair pulled back simply, a dress that had been washed so many times the color had gone somewhere between brown and gray, and both hands folded in her lap around a small cloth bag. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting, watching the street with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. "She looks lonely," Eli said. Colton looked at the woman. She seemed to feel them looking, glanced over, made brief eye contact with Colton, then immediately looked away. There was something practiced about the gesture, like someone used to being looked at with bad intentions who'd learned to make herself smaller under scrutiny. "Come on," Colton said, taking Eli's hand. He would have left it at that. He would have loaded his wagon and driven home, and that would have been the end of it. Except that Roy Harland, when Colton went back inside to settle the final count, mentioned her name. "That's Vivian Hale you were looking at," Roy said, not unkindly. He kept his eyes on the ledger. "Widow. Thomas Hale's wife, or was. He died maybe 18 months back. Horse accident out on the Crow property." Colton stacked a sack of flour on the counter. "What's she doing in town?" Roy paused with his pencil. "Trying to get by, best I can tell. She's got no family left in the territory. Thomas worked for Jeremiah Crow, and when he died, Crow turned her off the property before the funeral dirt had settled." The old man's mouth tightened. "She's been trying to take in mending work, washing, whatever people will give her." Another pause. "Most people won't give her much." "Why not?" Roy looked up then. "Because Crow says not to." Colton absorbed that. Jeremiah Crow was not a man you absorbed information about lightly. He owned the largest cattle operation in the territory, 12,000 acres, more than 100 employees at any given time, and the kind of money that didn't just buy land. It bought silence. It bought cooperation. It bought the look on Roy Harland's face right now, which was the look of a man who knew more than he'd said and wasn't going to say it. "She bother anyone?" Colton asked. "No." "She caused trouble?" "No." "Then what's Crow's problem with her?" Roy put the pencil down. "Crow's problem with her," he said carefully, "is that she's Thomas Hale's widow, and Thomas Hale, before he died, had started asking questions about cattle counts that didn't add up. Nothing was ever proven. Thomas fell off a horse. Accidents happen." He picked up the pencil again. "That'll be $4.60. He thought about it on the drive home. He thought about it while he unloaded the wagon and while he made Eli's dinner and while he sat on the porch afterward in the dark, listening to the dry wind move across the valley. He thought about the way she'd made herself small under his gaze, the practiced quality of it. Then he stopped thinking about it, because thinking about things he couldn't fix was a hole he'd fallen into before, and it didn't have a bottom. He was back in town 4 days later for a part he needed for the windmill pump. He left Eli at the ranch that time. The boy had been coughing slightly, nothing serious, but Colton wasn't taking chances. He came around the corner from the smithy and nearly walked into a scene in the middle of the street. 3 men. He recognized 2 of them, ranch hands from the Crow operation, names he half remembered from previous encounters. The third was a stranger. They were drunk, which at 10 in the morning said something about the kind of men they were. They had Vivian Hale backed against the exterior wall of the dry goods store, and the one in the middle was saying something to her in a low, carried voice, while his companions laughed. Colton couldn't hear the words from where he stood. He didn't need to. There were other people on the street. He could count 5 or 6, not including the 2 he could see through the window of the saloon. Everyone was finding extremely interesting things to look at that weren't the scene against the dry goods wall. A woman on the boardwalk across the street had discovered that the weave of her shopping basket required urgent examination. Vivian wasn't saying anything. Her face had gone flat and still in the way of someone who has survived this kind of thing before by simply enduring it. The man in the middle reached out and flicked the brim of her small hat. It fell to the dirt. He laughed. His friends laughed. Colton was moving before he'd made a decision about it. He covered the distance in about 10 seconds. The man in the middle heard him coming and started to turn. And Colton's fist connected with the side of his jaw with the full force of a man who'd been lifting fence posts and moving cattle for 15 years. The man sat down hard in the dirt. The other two lurched back, suddenly less certain about how this morning was going. One of them grabbed his friend's arm, and the three of them sorted themselves out into a staggering retreat, hurling back the particular kind of insults that men hurl when they're leaving faster than they intended to. The street had gone quiet. Colton stood there for a moment breathing. His hand hurt. He hadn't hit anyone in probably 3 years, and he'd forgotten the specific unpleasant sensation of knuckles meeting teeth. He turned around. Vivian Hale had her hat back in her hands, holding it against her chest. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Not gratitude exactly, more like someone who'd learned to be suspicious of unexpected kindness because it usually had a cost attached. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Her voice was quieter than he'd expected. "Probably not." "Now you'll have trouble with Crow's men." "Already do." She looked at him. He looked at her. Somewhere down the street, a horse shifted and blew out a breath. The woman with the basket had apparently resolved her weaving concerns and moved on. "I'm Colton Hayes," he said. "I have a ranch about 4 miles east. Hayes property, up on the second rise past the creek." "I know who you are," she said. "Your wife was Margaret. She was kind to me, once, at a church supper. Before." He hadn't expected that. The mention of Margaret hit him in the chest the way it always did, blunt and sudden, like walking into a doorframe in the dark. "Before what?" he managed. "Before Crow decided I was a problem." She turned her hat in her hands. The ribbon on it was torn, he noticed. Had been torn for a while from the look of it. "Thank you for what you did. But you should stay away from me, Mr. Hayes. People who stay near me tend to find it expensive." She started to walk away. He had absolutely no good reason for what he said next. "Can you cook?" She stopped. "Real question," he said. "I've got a 6-year-old boy. I can't cook. Not properly. The last 3 years have been biscuits and whatever I can manage, and the kid deserves better than that. I need someone to cook and help keep the house, and I'll pay fair wages and you'd have a room." She turned around slowly. The expression on her face had shifted into something more complicated. "You'd be taking me in," she said. "That's what this town would call it. I'd be hiring someone to help run a household. That's what I'd call it. Crow will make your life difficult. Crow's already made my life difficult. I'm short on cattle, short on water, and short on patience. One more difficulty won't change the math much." She studied him for a long moment. The smart thing, he could see her calculating it, was to say no. The smart thing was always to say no to something that looked like hope, because hope had a way of making the fall worse when it came. "I don't have much," she said finally. "A suitcase." "The room's small," he said. "It'll fit." He drove back to the ranch that afternoon with Vivian Hale sitting beside him on the wagon bench where Eli usually sat, a single worn suitcase in the back, and the particular feeling of a man who has done something that made no practical sense and can't decide if it was brave or stupid. Probably both. Eli was sitting on the porch when they pulled up, bundled in his coat against the afternoon chill, and he looked at Vivian with the frank assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend he isn't staring. "Are you going to live here?" he asked. "For a while," she said. "If that's all right with you." Eli considered this with great seriousness. "Can you make biscuits?" "I can. Papa's biscuits are bad." "Eli," Colton said. "They are, though." Vivian looked at the boy for a moment, and something crossed her face, something careful and slightly pained, like a muscle that hadn't been used in a long time being asked to work again. Then she smiled. It was small and not entirely steady, but it was real. "Then we'd better start tomorrow," she said. Dale Greer found out that evening and didn't say anything, which was his way of saying something. His brother Pete found out the next morning and said quite a bit, none of it directly to Colton, but loudly enough near the barn that it was clearly meant to be heard. Colton ignored it. He'd made his decision, and he wasn't in the habit of undeciding things. What he hadn't anticipated was the town. He found out from Roy Harlan 2 weeks later, when he came in for supplies, and Roy dropped his voice to just above a whisper and told him that Crow had been spreading it around that Colton Hayes had lost his mind and was disrespecting the memory of his wife by bringing a woman of questionable character into his home. Roy used the phrase questionable character with the careful emphasis of a man quoting someone else and wanting it known he was quoting. "What do people think?" Colton asked. Roy looked at the ceiling. "I think you should expect things to be harder than they already were." He wasn't wrong. The first sign was small. A water delivery Colton had arranged with a rancher named Doak simply didn't show up. When he rode out to ask about it, Doak met him at the gate with a look that wasn't quite apologetic and said he'd decided he couldn't make the trip after all. The second sign was at the grain store, where the price quoted to him was 15% higher than what had been agreed 2 months earlier. "Markets moved," he was told, and that was all. The third sign was the silence that descended when he walked into Harlan's, and a conversation between 3 men simply stopped and didn't start again until he'd left. He drove home that evening in the particular dark mood of a man watching a door close that he'd thought was open. Vivian was in the kitchen when he came in. She had a pot going on the stove. He could smell something that involved actual seasoning, which had become one of the small miracles of the past few weeks. And Eli was sitting at the table doing a lesson from the primer she'd produced from her suitcase, apparently a previous life's relic, and they were talking about something quietly, Vivian occasionally leaning over to point at a word. Colton stood in the doorway for a moment without either of them noticing him. The kitchen had been cleaned, not just wiped down, but actually cleaned. The windows had been washed, and the afternoon light came through them differently now, cleaner somehow. There was a small bunch of dried wildflowers on the windowsill that hadn't been there before. He didn't know why that hit him as hard as it did. They were just flowers. Dried out, nothing much. But the kitchen hadn't had anything on that windowsill in 3 years. Margaret had kept a small jar of herbs there, and after she died it had dried out and Colton had eventually thrown it away and left the windowsill bare because looking at things she'd touched was something he could only do in certain moods. Vivian had put something there again. Not because she'd known about the jar or the herbs or the specific geography of his grief. Just because a windowsill with nothing on it had looked bare to her, and she'd done something about it. He went back outside and sat on the porch until dinner was ready. 3 weeks after Vivian arrived, Crow came himself. Colton was in the far pasture checking on the remaining cattle when Dale came riding hard to find him with the look on his face of a man delivering bad news he'd rather not deliver. "Riders at the gate," he said. 8 of them, Crows in front. Colton had never actually spoken to Jeremiah Crow, though he'd seen the man from a distance. Up close, Crow was both larger and somehow less than Colton had expected. Tall and broad-shouldered and immaculately put together for a man who'd ridden out to someone else's property with armed escorts, which was either confidence or contempt, maybe both. He had a thick gray mustache and pale eyes that moved over the ranch with the calculating assessment of someone pricing it. "Hayes," he said when Colton rode up. Not a greeting exactly. "Mr. Crow. I'll come directly to the point." He rested his hands on his saddle horn. "The woman you've taken in is a disruption to this community. My men are distracted. My arrangements with other ranchers are being complicated. And you are stirring up a situation that benefits no one. I hired someone to help run my household," Colton said. "That's not a situation." "I'm telling you what it is," Crow said. His voice was perfectly even. "She goes, you put her on a wagon, and you send her somewhere. I don't particularly care where. You do that, and I'll see that the inconveniences you've been experiencing lately resolve themselves." Colton looked at the 8 armed riders arranged behind Crow with the patient stillness of men who did this kind of thing regularly. He looked at his own ranch, Bossuet, the modest house, the small barn, the dusty yard. His whole life, essentially. "No," he said. Crow's pale eyes moved to him with a quality of attention that Colton imagined most men found uncomfortable. "Son," he said quietly, "I am trying to give you a way out of this." "I heard you," Colton said. "The answer's no. You want to leave my property now? I'd be grateful." There was a long silence. Crow looked at him with the particular expression of a powerful man encountering an obstacle he genuinely hadn't planned for. Then he gathered his reins. "All right," he said, like it was nothing, like it was settled. "All right." They rode out. Colton sat on his horse in the yard for a minute after they'd gone, listening to the hoofbeats fade. His heart was hammering. He breathed deliberately until it slowed. Behind him, the door of the house opened. Vivian stood on the porch. She'd seen the riders from the window, he could tell. There was a particular kind of tension in how she was holding herself. "Was that Crow?" she asked. "Yes." A beat. What did he want? Colton looked at her. He thought about lying. He thought about the 8 armed riders, and the way Crow had said all right, like he was simply revising a plan, not abandoning one. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Go back inside. Dinner's going to get cold." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and went back inside. He stayed in the yard until the last of the light was gone from the sky, thinking about what he'd just done and what it meant and what came next. He didn't know exactly, but he'd made his choice and he was going to stand in it, whatever that cost. The night after Crow rode away, Colton couldn't sleep. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the ranch. The occasional shift of cattle in the pen, the creak of the windmill turning slowly in a wind too thin to do much good, the particular silence of a house that had more people in it now than it had yesterday. Through the wall, he could hear very faintly the sound of Vivian moving around in the small room at the end of the hall. She wasn't sleeping either. He thought about Crow's pale eyes, the way he'd said all right like a man closing a ledger book, not conceding anything, just moving on to the next column. Colton had dealt with men like that before, not Crow specifically, but the type. Men who treated other people's lives the way a chess player treats pieces. Patient, methodical, genuinely unbothered by what they had to do to win, because they'd long ago stopped thinking of the pieces as anything but pieces. The difference was that most men Colton had encountered who operated that way were eventually stopped by someone with more power than them. Out here, in Dry Creek Valley, Crow was the most powerful thing going. The law in town, a part-time sheriff named Aldred, who was closer to 60 than 50 and walked with a bad knee, was not going to be a factor. Everyone knew it. He rolled onto his side. The darkness didn't offer anything useful. Eventually, he got up, dressed quietly, and went out to the porch. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were out in full, which was one of the few things the valley still did without reservation. He sat on the top step with his coffee going cold in his hands and tried to think practically, which was what he did when fear started dressing itself up as something else. What he had was this: 29 cattle, 2 unreliable ranch hands, a drying creek, and now a woman in his house who Jeremiah Crow wanted gone badly enough to ride out personally with 8 armed men. What he didn't have was leverage, money to spare, or allies. That was the honest accounting of it. He was still sitting there when the door opened behind him and Vivian came out in her coat, carrying her own cup. She stopped when she saw him. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't know you were out here." "It's your porch too," he said. "For now." She hesitated, then sat on the step below his, which put a careful distance between them that he noticed and appreciated. She wrapped both hands around her cup the same way she'd held her hat that day outside the dry goods store, like she needed something to hold on to. They sat quiet for a while. The wind moved through the dry grass beyond the fence. "He's going to come back," she said. Not a question. "Yes. I've been thinking about what that means for you." She was looking out at the dark. "I don't want to be the reason someone else loses everything. I've watched it happen once already." He looked at the side of her face. In the starlight, she looked tired in a way that went deeper than just tonight. "You mean Thomas," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Thomas was a good man who started asking the wrong questions. He kept records, cattle counts, shipment dates, numbers that didn't match what Crow was reporting. He thought if he could document it, there'd be something someone could do about it. She paused. "He showed me the records 2 weeks before he died. He was proud of them. He thought they mattered." "What happened to them?" "I burned them," she said flatly, "the night after the funeral. Crow's men were going through the house while I was still trying to understand that Thomas was gone. I found the records first. I put them in the stove." She looked down at her cup. "I don't know if it was the right thing. I just knew that whatever Thomas had died for, I wasn't going to die for it too." Colton didn't say anything. He understood the mathematics of that decision in a way that went beyond argument. "And then Crow threw you out anyway." he said, 2 days after the funeral. One of his foremen came to the door and told me the house was needed for an incoming worker, and I had until morning. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. At least he waited until Thomas was in the ground. The wind moved through the grass again. Something out in the dark made a sound and was quiet. I'm not throwing you out, Colton said, just so that's clear. She turned to look at him directly for the first time since she'd come outside. Why? She asked. And I mean it seriously. You don't owe me anything. You don't know me. What you did in town was... I was grateful for it. But this is different. This is your livelihood. This is Eli's home. He thought about it. He was honest enough with himself to know that some part of the answer was that defending her had felt like the first time in 3 years he'd done something that mattered outside of just surviving. That his chest had been slightly less hollow since she'd arrived, not because of any romantic notion, but because the house smelled like food again, and Eli was doing his letters, and there was a small bunch of dried flowers on the kitchen windowsill that he couldn't stop thinking about. He didn't say any of that. It was too much to say to someone he'd known 3 weeks, sitting on a cold porch in the dark. Because Eli was right, he said finally. You did look lonely. She made a startled sound, not quite a laugh, but close to one. That's a terrible reason. Probably, he agreed. She looked at him for another moment, then looked back at the dark. Thank you, she said. Quiet, real. Don't thank me yet, he said. Crow's gonna make this ugly. She didn't disagree. She just drank her cold coffee in the starlight, and so did he. And eventually, they both went back inside. Colton slept a few hours before dawn. It was the best he'd slept in months. The changes happened gradually enough that it took him a few weeks to notice how complete they were. The kitchen was the first thing. Not just the cleaning, that had happened fast, but the way it came to function again as an actual room where someone lived rather than a space Colton passed through to grab food and leave. Vivian cooked with the focused competence of someone who'd done it most of her life, and she did it without fuss or performance. She didn't ask him what he wanted or make any kind of announcement about meals. Food simply appeared at reliable times, and it was real food. Seasoned and warm, and made with the assumption that the people eating it deserved to actually taste it. Eli, who had been surviving on his father's limited repertoire of biscuits, cold beans, and the occasional overcooked piece of salt pork, experienced this as something close to a revelation. The first time Vivian made a proper beef stew with vegetables from the small garden plot behind the house, which had been growing mostly weeds for 2 seasons, the boy ate 2 full bowls and then sat at the table with the dazed expression of someone who has just learned something important about the world. This is the best food I ever ate, he said. You're very easy to impress, Vivian told him. Papa's biscuits have rocks in them sometimes. They don't have rocks in them, Colton said. Hard things, Eli said. Colton looked at Vivian. She was looking very carefully at the stove. I'll show you how to make proper biscuits, she told Eli. It's not complicated. Your father just needs to actually measure the flour instead of guessing. I can hear you, Colton said. I know. That was the other thing. She had a dry wit that came out in these small sideways moments that caught him off guard. She didn't perform it. It surfaced naturally, usually when she thought no one was particularly watching for it, and then vanished again behind that careful reserve she carried most of the time. He found himself waiting for it without meaning to. She worked hard. Not ostentatiously, not in the way of someone trying to justify their presence, but with the steady, practical energy of a person who'd grown up with a long list in a short day. She repaired things he'd let go. A broken window latch, a loose porch board that he'd been stepping around for a year, a hinge on the barn door that shrieked like a wounded animal every time it moved. She did these things without telling him she was going to do them or asking whether she should. He'd come home from the pasture and find something fixed that he'd stopped noticing was broken. Dale said nothing about any of this, which Colton was starting to appreciate as the man's best quality. Pete said less than he had before, which probably meant he was sulking. But sulking Pete was preferable to opinionated Pete, so Colton left it alone. The hardest part was Eli. Not that the boy was difficult. The opposite. Eli attached to Vivian with the uncomplicated wholeness of a child who doesn't have the protective instincts adults develop after getting hurt. Within 2 weeks, he was following her around the way he'd once followed his mother, showing her things, asking her things, the particular constant low-level narration of a child who needs someone to talk to almost as much as he needs food and water. Colton watched it happen and felt something complicated moving through him. Relief and grief, and something else he couldn't name, all braided together. One evening he came in from the barn to find Vivian and Eli sitting at the kitchen table with the primer open between them, and Eli was reading aloud slowly, finger tracing under the words, and Vivian was listening with the patient attention of someone who actually cared whether the boy got it right. When Eli stumbled on a word, she didn't supply it immediately. She waited, let him work at it, and when he got it wrong, she said the sound slowly and let him try again. Colton stood in the doorway and didn't go in for a minute. He wasn't ready to be in that room yet. He went and sat on the porch, and after a while the sharp edge of whatever he was feeling dulled enough that he could go back inside and eat dinner like a normal person. He never told her what he'd seen. She'd have made it into something it didn't need to be. The trouble came in layers. First, the deliveries started failing. Water arrangements fell through. The grain price remained elevated with no good explanation. Then Nelson Aldrich, who ran the nearest neighboring ranch, 7 miles north, and had traded labor with Colton for 3 seasons running, sent a boy over with a note saying he wouldn't be able to help with the fall cattle work this year, no reason given. Colton read the note and put it in the stove. Then Harlan told him quietly one afternoon that 2 other merchants had been advised, in the careful indirect way that Crow conducted business, that extending credit to the Hayes Ranch would be an inconvenience to their own operations going forward. "What did they say?" Colton asked. "Bert said he'd think about it," Roy said. "Means no. Ella already moved your account to cash only." He looked uncomfortable. "I haven't done that." "I know, Roy. I just want you to understand I'm not going to do that." "I know," Colton said again. "I appreciate it." Roy's jaw worked for a moment. "That girl? Vivian? She's decent people, Colton. Whatever Crow says about her. I knew Thomas Hale. He was decent too." Colton nodded. He bought what he needed and drove home. The isolation tightened slowly, like a fence being built around the property, one rail at a time. He could function without Nelson's labor exchange with some difficulty. He could pay cash at Ella's store, though it strained things. What he couldn't do was make it through the season without water, and the creek was down to a thin channel that would be gone by late November if the drought held. He was looking at that thin channel on a cold morning in early November when Pete Greer rode up beside him. "We need to talk," Pete said. "We're talking. Me and Dale, we're going to have to find other work." He didn't quite meet Colton's eyes. "Crow's outfit pays better, and they're still hiring, and we've got a sister in town who says," "You don't have to explain it," Colton said. Pete shifted in his saddle. "It's not that we think you've done anything wrong." "Pete." "What?" "It's fine, go." They left the next morning. Colton didn't watch them go. He was in the north pasture doing work that now had no one to share it. He came back to the house that evening with his shoulders aching and his temper short, and walked into the kitchen to find Vivian at the stove and Eli asleep at the table with his face on his primer. He stood in the doorway and looked at the 2 of them and felt the pressure of the day sitting on his chest like a stone. "Dale and Pete are gone," he said. Vivian stirred whatever was on the stove. "I heard them leave. I'm down to just me." "I can help with the cattle work," she said. She turned to look at him. "I grew up on a working ranch. I can ride. I can do most of what needs doing." He almost said no reflexively, the old habit of the man who handles things alone. He stopped himself. "I know you can," he said. "I've seen you." She nodded once and turned back to the stove. "Sit down. You look like you're about to fall over." He sat down. Eli snored softly against the primer. Outside, the wind came across the valley with the particular sound of a winter arriving ahead of schedule. It was 3 days later that Crow came again. This time it wasn't a personal visit. It was 5 riders Colton didn't recognize. Not Crow's regular outfit, but the kind of men who got hired for specific jobs and didn't show their faces around afterward. They came to the gate in the mid-afternoon while Colton was in the barn and Vivian was hanging washing on the line. He heard the sound of horses and came out to find Vivian standing in the yard with the washing still in her hands and the 5 riders at the gate, and the man in front saying something to her with the particular casual menace of someone who knows the ratio of power is not in your favor. Colton came out of the barn and walked across the yard and stopped beside Vivian. "Something I can help you with?" he said. The man in front had a lean, weathered face and the kind of eyes that had long ago stopped carrying anything warm. "Just delivering a message," he said. "From Mr. Crow. He says the offer's expired. The woman leaves now or things get worse." "Worse how?" Colton said. The man looked past him toward the barn, toward the cattle pen, back to Colton. He didn't need to specify. The inventory of things that could be worse was self-evident. "Tell Crow the answer's still no," Colton said. The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Vivian with an expression that Colton felt land like a physical thing, contemptuous, measuring, the look of someone who had decided she wasn't worth the trouble of actual attention. Vivian stood very still beside him and said nothing. The riders turned and left. Vivian waited until the sound of hooves had faded before she moved. She went to the washing line and started hanging things again with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Vivian," he said, "I'm all right." "You don't have to." "I'm all right," she said again, sharper, then quieter. "I've had worse looks than that." He stood there watching her hang a shirt on the line, methodical and controlled, and felt something shift in him. Not a dramatic thing, more like a floorboard settling. A small movement, almost inaudible, but afterward the room sat slightly different. He was angry. He was genuinely, deeply angry, in a way that went past the practical concerns about water and cattle and money. He was angry that she stood in his yard and hung washing with hands that shook slightly because men kept coming to his gate to deliver messages about whether she was allowed to exist. He was angry at the whole machinery of it, the casual assumption that a person could be pushed around a landscape like furniture until she ended up somewhere nobody would notice her. He walked back into the barn. He needed something to do with his hands. That night after Eli was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and tried to do the math on what remaining options actually looked like. The numbers were not encouraging. Without the labor exchange with Aldrich, getting the remaining cattle through winter was going to be brutal. Without reliable water, it might be impossible. If Crow escalated to the cattle themselves, which those 5 riders had more or less implied he would, the situation could collapse inside of a month. Vivian came in from the back room and saw him at the table. She looked at the paper for a moment without asking to see it. "Is it bad?" she said. "Getting there." She sat down across from him. This close, with just the lamp between them, he could see the tiredness in her face clearly. Not just tonight's tiredness, but the older kind, the kind that accumulates in a person when life keeps asking them to be stronger than they're ready to be. "Tell me," she said. So he did. He laid it out plainly. The water, the cattle, the labor, the credit situation, the 5 riders, and what they'd implied. He didn't soften it. She was living inside the same problem he was. She was owed the honest version of it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "So Crow's strangling us," she said. "Yes, and the law won't help. Aldrid's scared of him. The county seat's 2 days' ride. And there's no one in the valley who'll stand up to him." Colton started to say yes to that too, and then stopped. There was something Roy Harland had said once, months ago, so briefly that he'd almost forgotten it. A name. He turned it over in his mind now and looked at it from different angles. "Maybe not no one," he said slowly. Vivian looked at him. "There's a man," Colton said. "Rancher north of Nelson Aldrich's place, past the Pine Ridge. I've never met him. Roy mentioned him once, said he'd had his own trouble with Crow. Lost half his cattle to some kind of boundary dispute that went Crow's way in county court. Roy said this man had been talking to some of the smaller outfits, trying to organize something. Organize what? I don't know. Roy wasn't specific." He folded the paper. "His name's Samuel Wu." Vivian processed this. "You're thinking about going to see him?" "I'm thinking I need to before Crow makes it so there's nothing left worth fighting for." She looked at him steadily. "Then go." "It might not lead anywhere." "Staying here definitely leads somewhere," she said. "Just somewhere Crow picked out." He looked at her across the table. The lamp flame wavered in a draft from somewhere, and the shadows moved. "Vivian," he said. And then he wasn't sure what he'd meant to say next because there was too much of it, and none of it had clear edges yet. She seemed to understand anyway, or understand that he'd run out of words, which was close enough. She nodded once, pushed back her chair, and stood up. "Get some sleep," she said. You need to be clear-headed if you're going to go convince a stranger to do something dangerous. She went back to her room. He stayed at the table for a while longer in the quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up. He could hear it moving over the valley, dry and cold and restless, the kind of wind that doesn't bring rain, just reminds you how long it's been since the last time it rained. He blew out the lamp and went to bed. A week later, he came home from the north pasture to find the barn door open. He hadn't left it open. He walked in and stood in the dim interior while his eyes adjusted, and then he saw it. 2 of his cattle were gone. Not dead, gone. The pen gate had been cut at the latch, cleanly, with a tool that knew what it was doing. Tracks led out through the fence and east toward the Crow property. He stood there in the barn and looked at the empty space in the pen for a long time. Then he went inside. Vivian was in the kitchen. Eli was somewhere in the back. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his hat in his hand, and she looked at his face and understood immediately. "What happened?" she said. "2 head. Gone." She set down what she was holding. Her expression was very controlled. "That leaves you 27. "Yes." "Then we're out of time," she said. He looked at her. She was right, and they both knew it. Standing still wasn't an option anymore. Crow had moved past warnings. "I'll go find Samuel Wu tomorrow," he said. She nodded. Then she turned back to the stove and kept working, because there was still dinner to make and a boy to feed, and none of the practical demands of the day had stopped, just because everything outside was tightening toward a conclusion that neither of them could fully see yet. Colton hung his hat by the door. He watched her for a moment. The straight line of her back, the sure movements of her hands, and felt the anger and the fear, and beneath them something he wasn't ready to name yet. A certainty, quieter than the rest, that whatever came next, he was not going to face it the way he'd faced the last 3 years. Alone. Samuel Wu's ranch was harder to find than Colton expected. Roy Harland had said north of the Pine Ridge, past Aldrich's land, which sounded simple enough until you were actually riding through country that had more ways to go wrong than right. The trail past the ridge thinned out to something barely worth calling a trail, and twice Colton had to backtrack where it disappeared entirely into rock and brush. He found the place by following smoke, a thin column rising from behind a stand of ponderosa pine that turned out to conceal a modest operation, a solid house built low to the ground against the wind, 2 good barns, and a cattle pen that held maybe 60 head despite what Crow's boundary dispute had taken from them. Someone here knew how to hang on. A man came out of the barn when Colton rode into the yard. He was maybe 40, shorter than Colton by several inches, with a compact, deliberate way of moving and a face that didn't give much away. He held a hammer loosely in one hand, not as a weapon, but not entirely not as one either. "You're on private land," he said. Neutral. Waiting. "I know it. I'm Colton Hayes. I have a ranch east of Dry Creek, past the second rise. Roy Harland told me your name." Samuel Wu looked at him for a moment. "Roy talk much about me?" "Just once. Said you'd had trouble with Crow, said you'd been trying to organize something. Roy talks more than he thinks he does." But the man's posture shifted fractionally. Not relaxed exactly, but less braced. "Get down off your horse. I'll hear what you came to say." They sat at a rough table inside the house, which was spare but clean and had maps pinned to one wall. Hand-drawn, detailed, the kind a man makes when he's been studying a problem for a long time. Samuel's wife brought coffee without being asked and left without speaking, which Colton read as the language of a household that had learned to conduct serious business quickly and without ceremony. "How bad is it for you?" Samuel asked. Colton told him. All of it. The water, the credit, the ranch hands leaving, the 5 riders, the 2 cattle gone from the pen last week. He kept it factual and didn't editorialize. Samuel listened the way certain people listen, without his eyes moving around and without the small performative nods that most people use to show they're paying attention. He just listened. When Colton finished, Samuel turned his coffee cup on the table slowly. "You took 11 of my cattle," Samuel said, 3 years ago. Boundary dispute. His lawyer found a surveying error in my original deed from 1874, and the county judge agreed with it. I lost the east quarter of my grazing land and the cattle on it." He paused. "The judge retired 6 months later and bought a house in Denver. Nice house, from what I heard." Colton said nothing. "Before that," Samuel continued, He ran off a family named Portis who'd been farming the South Draw for 8 years. Before that, he got Ed Malloy's water rights transferred to the Crow operation through the county water board, which Crow's brother-in-law happens to sit on. He looked at Colton directly. He's been building this for a long time. He's not going to stop. How many ranchers have you talked to? Colton asked. 7. 3 have given me something close to a commitment. The others are scared, which I understand. Samuel looked at the maps on the wall. The problem is that alone, none of us has enough to fight him. Combined, we still don't have enough to fight him through the law because he owns too much of the law, which means we need another option, Colton said. Samuel looked back at him. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it since 2 of my cattle went missing. The option I've been considering, Samuel said slowly, is not fighting him here at all. Colton waited. There's a valley north of the Callahan Range, beyond the mountain pass. I've been up there twice, once in summer, once in early fall. Samuel stood and crossed to the maps on the wall, pointing to a hand-drawn section that Colton could see was the mountain range north of the valley. It's untouched. Good grass, 2 reliable water sources, protected on 3 sides by the mountains. Crow doesn't have claims up there. Nobody does. The territory hasn't been formally surveyed past the pass. Colton stared at the map. You're talking about leaving. I'm talking about taking what we have and building somewhere Crow can't reach us. Samuel kept his voice even, but there was something underneath it, conviction that had clearly been tested and come out harder. Staying means slow destruction. He'll take it piece by piece, cattle, credit, water, until there's nothing left worth taking. And then he'll buy whatever remains for nothing. The pass, Colton said. That's the widow's pass. I've heard stories about it. The stories are mostly accurate, Samuel said, with a bluntness that Colton respected. It's dangerous, mountain weather, narrow sections, the elevation. With wagons and cattle, it would take at minimum 12 days if everything goes well. He paused. Everything won't go well. Colton looked at the map for a long time. He thought about Eli. He thought about the 27 cattle that were left. He thought about Vivian's hands, not quite steady, after the riders came to the gate. When? He said. I need 3 more commitments, Samuel said. I'm not leading families into those mountains on the strength of 3. Come back with me and we'll have enough to make it work. That's a big thing to ask someone to agree to without knowing what they're agreeing to. Yes, Samuel said. It is. Colton drove back to his ranch in the thin winter light with a feeling he couldn't quite categorize, not hope exactly, which had become too expensive a thing to carry casually. More like the feeling of a man who has been sitting in a flooding room and has finally found a door, without knowing yet what's on the other side of it. Vivian was in the yard when he got back, patching a section of fence near the cattle pen with the focused patience of someone who understands that things fall apart faster than they get fixed, and you have to keep going anyway. She looked up when he rode in. How was he? She asked. Colton swung down from the horse. Serious, smart. He's been planning this longer than we have. Planning what exactly? He told her about the valley, about the pass, about Samuel's maps and his accounting of what Crow had done to the various ranchers in the valley over the past decade. Vivian listened without interrupting, still holding the fence wire, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He wants to run, she said. Not a judgment, just naming it. He wants to survive, Colton said. There's a difference. She turned this over. Is there enough time to get through a mountain pass before winter locks it? Samuel thinks if we move within the next 3 weeks, maybe 4. After that, the upper elevations become too dangerous. 3 weeks, she said. Or we stay, he said, and we keep losing ground. She looked at the fence wire in her hands, then at the cattle pen behind her, then at the house. He could see her doing what he'd done. The accounting. What they had, what they stood to lose, what leaving meant against what staying meant. Eli could handle the journey? She asked. He could, Colton said. He was fairly sure of this. Eli was small but not fragile. He had his mother's constitution, which had been iron right up until the fever that iron couldn't stop. He didn't let himself follow that thought any further. All right, Vivian said. She set the wire down. Then we go. He looked at her. Just like that? You want me to agonize about it longer? I want to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to. She looked back at him steadily. I understand that Crow is going to keep taking until there's nothing. I understand that 3 weeks is a small window. I understand that mountain passes are dangerous. She picked up the wire again. I also understand that I've spent the last 18 months being told where I'm allowed to exist. I'm done letting other people decide that. He didn't have anything to add to that. He went to unsaddle his horse. The next 2 weeks were a kind of controlled chaos that Colton would remember afterward as one of the harder things he'd done. And he'd done some hard things. Samuel arranged a meeting, quiet, no public announcement, at his ranch, where 11 families gathered on a cold evening to hear the plan laid out. Colton went and sat in the back and watched Samuel work the room with the patience of a man who understood that frightened people need honesty more than reassurance, even when honesty is harder to deliver. The families were various. 3 ranching outfits, including Colton and Samuel himself, 2 farming families from the south draw that Crow had been squeezing on water rights, a blacksmith named Fergus Doyle, who'd refused to service Crow's equipment after a wage dispute and had been finding his business mysteriously declining ever since, and several others who'd accumulated their own private histories with Crow's machinery of control. They were scared and they were angry, and several of them were both at once, which made for a complicated room. A rancher named Bill Garrett, heavy-set and red-faced, said what several people were thinking. We're talking about abandoning everything we've built. Everything. We're talking about getting out with what we have before Crow takes that too, Samuel said. He can't take everything. He took 11 of my cattle and a quarter of my land through the county court, Samuel said evenly. He put the Portis family on a wagon with $60 in their furniture. He cut off Ed Malloy's water until Malloy sold to him for a third of what the land was worth. A beat. Tell me what he can't take. Garrett was quiet. A woman near the front, Ruth Doyle, Fergus's wife, with the steady gaze of someone who'd been married to a stubborn man long enough to have developed her own considerable stubbornness, said, What about the pass? My sister's husband crossed it 6 years ago. He said the upper section is dangerous, Samuel said. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. I've been up there. I know what we're looking at. People have died on that pass, someone said from the back. People have died staying here too, Vivian said. The room went quiet. She was sitting beside Colton near the wall, and she hadn't spoken until now. Several people looked at her with the particular attention of people who know a story about someone and are trying to reconcile it with the actual person. Thomas Hale, she said. She kept her voice level. He died asking questions about missing cattle on the Crow property. Nobody in this room doesn't know that. The official story is a riding accident, and the official story is what it is. She looked around the room without aggression, just directness. I'm not saying Crow is behind everything bad that's ever happened in this valley. I'm saying that I watched a good man get destroyed for asking the wrong questions, and I watched a county court agree with Crow's lawyers 3 times in a row, and I've been refused service at 4 businesses in this town because Crow decided I was inconvenient. She paused. The pass is dangerous. Crow is also dangerous. At least with the pass, you know what you're up against. It wasn't a speech. It was just facts delivered by someone who'd lived them, and the room felt it. By the end of the evening, 15 families had committed. The preparation moved fast because it had to. Each family was told to take what they could carry in a wagon, prioritize food and tools and seed over furniture and anything that was heavy without being useful. Cattle would be driven alongside. Samuel drew up a supply list and distributed tasks: who would handle what, who had what skills, how the driving order would work on the trail. Colton spent those 2 weeks in a state of concentrated motion that left him exhausted enough to sleep, which was its own form of mercy. He sold 3 of his remaining cattle to Roy Harland at fair price for cash. Roy didn't ask why, and Colton didn't explain, though Roy's face said he'd drawn his own conclusions. He packed the wagon with what mattered: food, tools, warm clothing, Eli's primer, the small photograph of Margaret that lived on the mantel. He took it down the night before they left and held it for a moment and then packed it carefully between 2 folded blankets. He didn't explain to Eli what was happening until 3 days before departure. He sat the boy down at the kitchen table and told him as plainly as he could that they were going on a long journey, that it would be hard, that they were going with other families to find a better place. Eli was quiet for a moment, processing. Is Vivian coming? Yes. Will it be scary? Colton looked at his son's face, 6 years old, round and serious under his father's weathered features. already asking about bravery before he'd had the chance to be frightened. "Probably some parts," he said. Eli nodded, apparently satisfied. "Okay," he said, and went back to his primer. Vivian, watching from the doorway, caught Colton's eye, and they shared a look that didn't need words. They were 2 days from departure when Crow escalated past words. Colton was in the barn at dawn when he heard it. A sound that was wrong. Not an animal sound, but a human one, coming from the direction of the feed storage building near the pasture fence. He grabbed the rifle that leaned against the stall post and came out into the gray morning light. The storage building was burning. Not the whole thing. Not yet. But the east wall had caught, and the fire was moving with the wind toward the main structure. He ran. He had a pump line from the water trough, and he dragged it as far as it would go and worked for 20 minutes in the smoke and pre-dawn cold, while the fire argued with the water about which would win. He lost the east wall entirely, but saved the rest. When it was over, he stood in the yard covered in ash and smelling of smoke with the dawn coming up pale and cold over the ridge. And he understood that this was the message. Crow knew something was moving. Maybe he'd heard something. Maybe he'd simply concluded that after 2 stolen cattle and 5 threatening riders and a winter of economic strangulation, a man like Colton Hayes would either break or do something. And Crow was making sure the cost of doing something was clear. Vivian came out of the house when she smelled the smoke and stood at the edge of the yard with Eli behind her, the boy's hand in hers, both of them watching the smoldering wall. "He knows," Colton said. "Or suspects," she said. "Same thing, with him." She looked at the damage. "Does this change anything?" He thought about Samuel's maps, the valley on the other side of the pass, the 15 families who'd made their commitments and were right now packing their wagons. "No," he said. "We leave in 2 days. Same plan." She nodded. She took Eli back inside to start breakfast. Colton stayed in the yard looking at the burned wall a moment longer, then went to clean up. The night before they left, Colton sat on the porch for a long time in the dark. The stars were out again. The valley lay quiet around him in the cold. The dry grass, the thin creek, the dust that had been settling on everything for 2 years. He'd come to this land when he was 26, with Margaret and more optimism than sense. He'd buried her here. He'd nearly buried himself here too, just more slowly. He didn't think he was going to miss it. That surprised him a little. The door opened behind him and Vivian came out, same as the night a few weeks ago. Same coat, different situation entirely. She sat on the step without asking whether he wanted company, which by now she'd understood he didn't. They were quiet for a while. "You ever been through a mountain pass?" he asked. "No?" "Me neither." She looked out at the dark valley. "Samuel has. Twice. In better conditions than we're going to have. Then we trust Samuel's judgment on the trail," she said, "and we watch out for each other." He looked at her profile in the starlight. There was something he'd been not saying for weeks, since the night she'd told him about burning Thomas's records, maybe, or since the morning he'd come in from the barn and found her and Eli at the table with the primer, or some other specific moment he couldn't pinpoint precisely because it hadn't been one moment, but a whole accumulation of them. "I'm glad you came here," he said. Simple. Just that. She turned to look at him. The careful reserve she usually carried had softened at the edges. It was late, and she was tired, and they were leaving tomorrow, and there wasn't much left to protect against. "I wasn't going to," she said, "when you asked me. In the street. My first thought was that you were either foolish or you wanted something." "What was your second thought?" She almost smiled. "That Margaret Hayes must have been something, to have raised a son and married a man and still had enough kindness left over to lend to strangers." She paused. "Roy told me once that she'd been the one who first stood up for me in town, before I even knew I needed it, before Thomas died." Colton absorbed that. He hadn't known. Margaret had never mentioned Vivian to him, but Margaret had been like that. She did things without making announcements about them. "She was something," he said quietly. Vivian nodded. They sat with that for a moment, the weight and the rightness of it together. "Tomorrow's going to be hard," she said finally, and stood up. "Yes." "Get some sleep, Colton." He watched her go inside. He stayed on the porch another few minutes in the cold, listening to the valley one last time. The dry wind, the thin creek, the distant sound of cattle that would be moving at first light. Then he went to bed. At dawn, 15 families pointed their wagons north, toward the mountains that rose dark and enormous, against a sky that was just beginning to turn pale at the edges. The children were sleepy and quiet. The cattle moved in a restless herd alongside. Samuel rode at the front with a rifle across his saddle and a calm face that Colton recognized as the expression of a man who'd already made his peace with the difficulty ahead. Colton drove his wagon with Eli wedged between him and Vivian on the bench. The boy had fallen back asleep within 10 minutes, head against Vivian's arm, indifferent to the gravity of the moment in the way only a 6-year-old can be. Vivian watched the ranch disappear behind them as the trail curved north. She didn't say anything. She looked until it was gone, and then she looked forward. Colton kept his eyes on the mountains. The pass waited up there somewhere in the cold gray distance, patient as rock, indifferent to what they needed from it. Crow was behind them, and winter was above them, and ahead was the only thing left to do. They rode into it. The first 3 days were merely hard. That was how Colton would remember them later. Not as the worst part, but as the part where everyone still believed the worst part was ahead of them, rather than already happening. The trail north from Dry Creek Valley climbed gradually through pine forest and scrub oak, following a creek bed that had enough water in it to be useful, though the creek got thinner the higher they went. Samuel set a pace that was demanding but not punishing, up before full light, moving by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline, stopping an hour before dark to make camp while there was still enough light to see what you were doing. It was disciplined and it worked, and for those first 3 days the convoy moved with something close to efficiency. Eli was fascinated by everything. He sat on the wagon bench asking questions about the trees, the birds, the rock formations along the trail, occasionally about the other children in the convoy, whom he'd cataloged by name within the first 2 hours. He had his mother's ability to find people interesting, which was a quality Colton had forgotten he'd been missing. The 4th day, the trail narrowed. Not dangerously, not yet, but enough that the wagons had to go single file through sections where the pine forest pressed close on both sides, and the ground turned from packed dirt to loose shale that made the horses nervous. They lost an hour in the afternoon when one of the Garrett family's wagon wheels cracked on a hidden rock shelf. Bill Garrett had a spare wheel, but fitting it on that ground took 4 men in 90 minutes and a significant amount of profanity, some of it in languages Colton couldn't identify. Samuel came back down the line to check on the delay, assessed the situation, and went to help without comment. That was the thing about Samuel Wu that Colton kept noticing. He didn't waste energy on reactions to things that couldn't be unhappened. Something went wrong. He looked at it, he figured out what could be done, and he did it. It was the most useful quality a leader could have on a journey like this, and Colton was aware enough to learn from it. By the 5th day, this elevation was doing things to the air that everyone felt in their lungs and said nothing about, because saying it didn't help. The cold came down hard on the 5th night. They'd made camp on a flat shelf above the tree line, the first camp without the shelter of forest, and the wind that came off the upper peaks was a different animal than anything the valley had offered. It moved through clothing and bedding with a searching indifference to what it found, and by morning 3 of the smaller children were coughing, and one of the Doyle family's cattle had wandered off the trail edge in the dark and was gone. Fergus Doyle took that loss with his jaw clenched and his eyes somewhere distant. Ruth Doyle put her hand on his arm briefly and then went to check on the coughing children, because that was how you handled grief on a moving trail. You felt it for a moment, and then you kept going. Colton checked on Eli first thing in the morning and found the boy still asleep, burrowed so deep into his blankets that only the top of his head was visible. He was breathing normally. Colton counted that as a good morning and went to help Samuel figure out the day. The attack came on the 7th day. They were in a narrow section. The trail squeezed between a rock face on the left and a steep drop on the right that fell away into a ravine maybe 200 feet down. The convoy had slowed to a crawl because the footing was treacherous, and everyone could hear what falling off that edge would mean. The cattle were difficult here, pushing against each other with the nervous energy of animals who understood danger in their bones even when they couldn't articulate it. Colton was riding alongside the 3rd wagon when he heard the first shot. It came from above, from the rock face on the left, and it hit the canvas of the 2nd wagon and went through it cleanly, which meant it had been aimed low to frighten rather than kill, or had missed its mark, which wasn't much comfort either way. Then a second shot and a third, and the cattle broke in a surge of noise and hooves that was immediately the most dangerous thing happening regardless of who was firing. Colton pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard in one motion and was off his horse before the echo of the third shot had finished. "Vivian!" he shouted, already moving. She was already moving. She had Eli off the wagon bench and behind the wagon body in the time it took Colton to cover 20 feet, and she had her rifle up against the wagon side, scanning the rock face above. Her face was tight and absolutely focused. "3 positions," she said when he got to her. 2 high on the left, 1 lower. He looked. She was right. He could see the smoke signatures from 2 elevated positions maybe 40 feet up the rock face, and a third puff of gun smoke from a boulder cluster at trail level around the bend ahead. Someone had planned this, planned it well enough to know where the trail narrowed and where the convoy would be slowest. "Crow," he said, "or men he hired." She fired once at the lower boulder position, not randomly, at something specific she'd seen. There was a shout from behind the boulder and then silence from that position. Samuel came up the line at a crouch, fast. "How many?" "At least 3 positions, maybe more around the bend." Samuel looked at the cattle, which were pushing dangerously toward the right edge in their panic. "If the herd goes over—" "I know," Colton said. "Fergus and Bill are trying to turn them back. They need 10 minutes. We'll hold." Colton looked at Vivian. She was already reloading. What followed was the longest 20 minutes of Colton's life, and he'd had some long ones. The shooting from the rock face was intermittent, not the volume of fire you'd expect from men who were serious about killing everyone, which confirmed that this was designed to scatter and destroy rather than massacre outright. Drive the cattle over the edge, trap the convoy in the narrow section, leave them stranded in the mountains with no herd and no way forward. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It was working on the cattle side of things until Fergus Doyle, who turned out to have a voice that could stop a stampede, got himself in front of the lead animals and simply refused to move while shouting at them in a volume and register that cut through their panic. The cattle stopped. They milled and shoved and were terrible about it, but they stopped. With the herd no longer breaking, Samuel reorganized the return fire with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd clearly thought about defensive positions on this trail before this particular day. 3 men covering the high left positions. 2 more around the bend where Vivian's shot had quieted the lower boulder. The convoy women and children pulled beneath and behind the wagons. Ruth Doyle crawled from wagon to wagon, passing ammunition without being asked to. The firing from the rock face slowed, then stopped. There was a long silence broken only by the wind and the nervous shuffling of cattle and the thin sound of a child crying somewhere in the middle of the convoy. Then from above, distant hoofbeats moving away, north along the ridgeline, away from the pass, going to report back, going to tell Crow that the first attempt hadn't worked. Samuel stood up slowly, rifle still in hand, and looked at the ridge. His face gave nothing away, but Colton could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the revision of assumptions, the new math. "He's going to try again," Colton said. "Yes, he'll know more now. He'll know roughly where we are in the pass." "How much further to the high section? 2 days? Maybe 3. The worst section is the upper traverse, about 4 miles of trail that has no room for error in any direction." Samuel looked at him. "If he gets men positioned there ahead of us, we have a real problem." "Can we move faster?" "Some. Not much." Samuel looked back at the convoy, the shaken families, the restless cattle, the 2 wagons that had taken small damage to canvas and wood. "I'm going to ask people to push harder tomorrow. I need you to help me convince them." "I'll talk to them tonight," Colton said. Vivian had come up beside him during this exchange. She was still holding her rifle, the barrel down, and there was something in her expression that Colton couldn't immediately read. He looked at her. "You all right?" he said. "I hit someone," she said. Not distressed exactly, more like a person processing the specific weight of a fact they'd known was possible but hadn't lived yet. "Behind that boulder." "You protected these people." "I know," she breathed out. "I know." He put his hand on her shoulder briefly. Just a moment, nothing more, and felt her lean into it the smallest amount before straightening again. "Let's check on Eli," she said. The boy was behind the wagon where she'd put him, sitting cross-legged with a rock in each hand, trying to look less frightened than he was, and succeeding only moderately. When he saw them both coming, he stood up fast. "I stayed down," he said immediately. "I stayed down the whole time." "I know you did," Vivian said. "I saw you." She crouched in front of him and looked at his face with the careful attention of someone checking inventory. "Are you hurt?" "No." "A beat. My hands are shaking." "Mine too," she said. She held up one hand to show him. A slight tremor, genuine. His shoulders came down from around his ears. "Why does that happen?" he asked. "Because your body is smart enough to know something scary happened, and it takes a while for the rest of you to catch up," she said. "It's normal." Eli considered this. "Papa's not shaking." "Your father has had longer to practice looking like he isn't," she said, and glanced up at Colton with an expression that was so precisely accurate, he almost said something that would have been entirely inappropriate given the circumstances. That night was cold and quiet, and nobody slept well. The family sat in clusters around fires that Samuel kept deliberately small, and Colton moved between them the way he'd seen Samuel do, not making speeches, just sitting for a few minutes with each group, listening to what people were saying, and occasionally providing the specific kind of steady response that doesn't promise anything impossible, but makes the next hour feel survivable. Bill Garrett, who'd been the loudest voice of doubt at Samuel's meeting weeks ago, sat beside Colton at the Garrett family fire and was quiet for a while. His wife Annie had finally gotten their youngest to sleep against her shoulder. "If they hit us again on the upper section," Bill said quietly, not wanting Annie to hear. "In a tight spot." "Then we hold again," Colton said. "We got lucky today." "We did," Colton agreed. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "We also held." "Both things are true." Bill was quiet. "My grandfather came west in '49, he said. Said the hardest part wasn't the trail. Said it was the wanting to turn back." "What did he do with the wanting?" "Kept going," Bill said simply. Colton nodded. The 8th day was a forced march that cost the convoy in exhaustion what it bought in distance. Samuel pushed the pace hard, and nobody complained because the alternative was understood. They climbed through terrain that stopped being a trail and became a suggestion. Loose rock and exposed root and sections where the wagons had to be manhandled around bends that the design of wheels had not anticipated. 2 wagons were lightened by necessity, their occupants' belongings reduced to what could be carried. A chest of dishes that a woman named Clara Briggs had brought from her mother's house in Missouri went over the edge of a steep section because it was too heavy and there was no choice. She watched it go without saying anything and then helped push the wagon forward. Colton watched things like that happen all day and felt them accumulate into something he couldn't name cleanly. Not admiration exactly, more like the recognition of what people actually are when the comfort gets stripped away. On the 9th day, they reached the upper traverse. Samuel stopped at the entrance to it in the early morning and stood looking at it for a long moment. Colton came up beside him. The traverse was exactly what Samuel had called it. 4 miles of trail cut into the face of the mountain, with the rock face rising on one side and nothing on the other side for a very long way. The trail was wide enough for a wagon, barely. In sections, it was wide enough for a wagon and a prayer. "Wind's going to be a problem," Samuel said. "When isn't it? Up here, it can move a horse sideways." He looked at Colton. "Cattle go first. They're the most dangerous. If they panic on the traverse, we lose them and probably some wagons. Once the cattle are across, wagons one at a time. People on foot alongside." "How long will the crossing take?" "All day. Maybe into dark." "Can we do it in the dark?" Samuel looked at him. "We might not have a choice." They were 3 wagons into the traverse, moving slowly, one at a time, the cattle already across and held at the far end by 2 of the younger men, when Colton heard the horses behind them. He turned. Coming up the trail below the traverse entrance, maybe half a mile back, riders. Enough of them to be a problem. The afternoon light caught metal. "Samuel." His voice was flat. Samuel turned and looked. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "How many more wagons?" 9. "They'll be on us before we're across." "I know." Colton looked at the traverse, at the riders, at the families standing along the trail, watching with the particular stillness of people who've just understood that something is about to require everything they have. Get the wagons moving. Faster. One right after another. Don't wait for the one ahead to clear. That's dangerous, yes. So is what's behind us. He looked at Samuel directly. Get them across. I'll hold the entrance. Samuel looked at him for a moment with an expression that was several things at once. Then he nodded and moved. Vivian appeared at Colton's side. She had her rifle and her coat and the expression on her face that he'd come to recognize as her version of ready. Not calm exactly, but past fear, operating on something harder. Eli is with Ruth Doyle, she said before he could ask. He's going on the next wagon. You don't have to stay here. I know. She checked her rifle. How many do you count? 15, maybe more. We have 6 men who can shoot. 7, said Fergus Doyle, materializing from behind a wagon with his rifle and the particular expression of a man who has recently lost a cattle animal and a chest of his wife's dishes and is ready to stop losing things. Colton looked at the 7 of them. Fergus, 2 of the younger ranchers, himself, Vivian, Samuel's nephew, a farmer named Cord who'd mentioned at some point that he'd fought in the war and hadn't mentioned which side, which Colton had decided not to ask about. We hold the entrance, Colton said. We don't have to win. We have to give the wagons time to get across. And then? Cord asked. Then we cross too. Across that thing? Cord looked at the traverse. Fast, Colton said. The riders came at a controlled pace that spoke to a commander who'd done this before. No screaming charge, just a steady approach that was deliberate and professional and somehow more frightening for its patience. The man at the front wasn't Crow. He was a hired operator, and he had 15 men fanned across the trail behind him, with rifles up. Last chance, the man called out, still 40 yards back. Mr. Crow's offer stands. Leave the cattle. Turn back. Nobody gets hurt. Colton didn't respond. He looked at Vivian beside him. She was sighting down the barrel at the lead rider with the focused patience of someone who'd grown up on a working ranch and knew exactly what a rifle was for. The man waited 10 seconds. Then he raised his hand and the riders came forward. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not a battle in any cinematic sense. It was loud and confusing and terrifying and intermittently absurd. The absurdity being that people were firing rifles at each other on a mountain trail, while wagons tried to navigate a 4-inch margin of error 40 feet above a ravine. Colton fired and reloaded and fired, and at some point took a cut across his left forearm from a rock fragment that a bullet threw up, which he didn't notice until afterward. Vivian fired steadily beside him, methodical in a way that he found both reassuring and, somewhere underneath the fear, something else entirely that was absolutely not the right time to examine. 2 of Crow's riders went down in the first minutes. 3 more pulled back out of the direct line. The remaining 10 spread wide to try to flank the entrance point, which was what Colton had been afraid of, and for a moment it looked like the line would break. Then a sound from the traverse behind them. A long shout, Ruth Doyle's voice, calling that the last wagon was across. "Move!" Samuel shouted. The retreat to the traverse was not orderly. It was 7 people going as fast as you can go when you're being shot at, and the route available to you is a 4-mile mountain ledge. Cord was first onto the traverse, then Fergus, then the 2 younger ranchers. Samuel's nephew stumbled on the entrance rock and Colton grabbed his arm and shoved him forward. Vivian went. Colton went last. The traverse in full dark, at a run, with men firing from below. He would later be unable to describe it coherently because the mind protects itself from certain things by refusing to store them in order. He remembered the sound of the wind, which was enormous up there. He remembered the feel of the rock wall under his right hand, which he kept contact with continuously because the left side was the kind of dark that told you nothing useful about distance or depth. He remembered Vivian's voice ahead of him, calling back his name once to tell him she was there, and how that single word was the most useful piece of information he received in those 4 miles. He remembered thinking, with a clarity that surprised him, given everything else happening, I'm not ready to die. Not because of the cattle or the land or any of what he'd spent 3 years grinding himself down over. He was not ready to die because there was a woman 15 feet ahead of him on this mountain in the dark calling his name. And there was a boy on the other side of the traverse waiting to see if his father was coming. And the sum of those 2 facts was worth more than anything he'd left behind in Dry Creek Valley. The firing from below grew distant, then stopped. They came off the far end of the traverse into a chaos of torchlight, and crying children and cattle that had tired themselves out being terrified and were now just standing in miserable clusters. Ruth Doyle appeared out of the torchlight and grabbed Fergus with both arms. Eli came from somewhere and hit Colton in the midsection at a dead run in the way of a child who has been waiting very still and very frightened and has used up all his stillness. Colton held on. He crouched down and held on. "I heard the shooting," Eli said into his shoulder. "I counted." "Counted what?" "The shots. I was counting, and then I stopped because there were too many." "We're all right," Colton said. Everyone made it. Eli pulled back and looked at him, then looked past him. Vivian? She was right there. She'd been right behind Colton off the traverse, was standing 3 feet away watching this reunion with her rifle still in her hand and something in her face that she wasn't trying to hide. When Eli looked at her, she crouched down too, and the boy went to her, and she held him with the one arm not holding the rifle, hard and brief, and then stood up. She and Colton looked at each other across the torchlight. Her hair had come half down from its pins somewhere on the traverse. There was dust on her coat and her face, and she had a bruise forming at her cheekbone from something he hadn't seen happen. She looked nothing like someone in a painting and everything like someone who'd just done something real. He crossed the 3 feet between them without making a decision about it, and she didn't move back. He took her face in both hands, his hands that were shaking now, finally, all that deferred shaking arriving at once, and looked at her. "I need to say something," he said. "Colton, let me," he breathed. "I know the timing of this is terrible." "The timing is catastrophic," she said, but she wasn't pulling away. "You brought my house back to life. You brought my son back to life." He stopped, started again. "I spent 3 years trying to survive without caring about anything, and it turns out that doesn't work for long. And somewhere between the windowsill flowers and the biscuits and tonight on that mountain, He ran out of the prepared version. "I love you. That's the short version." She looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the camp moved and cried and sorted itself out. And for the length of that moment, none of it was relevant. "The timing really is terrible," she said. "I know. We're filthy and we're exhausted and we're on a mountain in the dark." "I know." She put her hand over his. "I love you too," she said. "Ask me again when we're not covered in trail dust and I'll give you a better answer." He almost laughed. He pressed his forehead to hers for a moment, and she let him, and then they both straightened up because the camp needed sorting, and Samuel was organizing the night watch, and Eli was hovering 3 feet away pretending not to be watching. "Did you hear that?" Eli asked, transparently. "Mind your primer," Vivian said. "I don't have my primer. It's on the wagon." "Then mind something else," Colton said. The boy grinned, the first grin Colton had seen from him in days, and went to go find something to mind. Samuel came over with the look of a man who'd tallied everything and was now presenting the bill. "No casualties," he said. 3 people with minor injuries. We lost 2 head of cattle in the crossing. They went over the edge in the dark." A pause. "Crow's men didn't follow us onto the traverse." "They won't come this way," Colton said. "Not enough of them left, and they'd have to cross the same ground." He looked north, where the trail descended away from the traverse into darkness. "He might try to go around, come at us from the north if he knows the territory." "He might," Samuel said. "We need to move fast tomorrow." "How far to the valley?" 2 days. Samuel looked at him steadily. "We're going to make it." It wasn't reassurance, exactly. It was a statement of intention from a man who'd already decided it was true and was working backward from there. Colton understood that kind of math. 2 days, he said. He sat up most of that night on the edge of the camp, watching the traverse and the dark trail and the stars above the mountain peaks. The cold was deep and specific and got into every place his clothing wasn't quite adequate. He didn't mind it. His arm had been wrapped with a strip of Vivian's spare cloth. She'd found the cut when they were getting Eli settled and dealt with it without making a scene, which he appreciated. It stung. He was alive. Around him, the families slept or tried to. Mothers with children pulled close, men with rifles across their laps, cattle standing in their miserable clusters in the dark. These people had given up their land, their credit, their neighbors, their buildings, their furniture, some of their cattle. And tonight, some of them had given up the last easy assumption that leaving was going to be the safe choice. None of them were going back. That was the thing he kept returning to as the night wore on. Not a single family had turned back. Not after the first attack. Not after the traverse. Not after the dark and the cold and the sounds on the mountain that nobody could identify and nobody asked about because asking didn't help. They were going forward because there was a valley on the other side that nobody had poisoned yet, and because the person standing behind you on a mountain trail is the person you trust when everything else has been taken away. He sat in the cold and watched the dark and waited for morning. Morning came the way it does after nights like that. Not gently, not with any particular mercy, just with light that revealed everything the dark had hidden and asked you to deal with it. Colton was already on his feet when the first gray edge appeared above the eastern peaks. His back ached from the ground and his arm throbbed under Vivian's makeshift bandage, and he had the particular hollow feeling behind his eyes of a man who'd slept maybe 90 minutes in 4-hour increments with his rifle across his knees. He walked the perimeter of camp, spoke briefly with the 2 men on the last watch shift, and then stood at the northern edge of their position, looking down the trail that descended away from the traverse into the tree line below. Nothing moving, no riders, no dust on the trail. Samuel appeared beside him with 2 cups of coffee so thin it was mostly hot water, and handed one over without comment. They stood and looked at the trail together. "You think he's done?" Colton asked. "No," Samuel said. "I think he's regrouping. The question is whether he knows another route to the valley." "Does he?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. "There's a trail that comes around the south end of the Callahan Range, longer by 4 days at minimum. More if the weather's been bad up there, which it has. If he knew about it and moved men the same day we left Dry Creek," he calculated, "he could be there. In the valley. Ahead of us." Colton drank his thin coffee. "Then we move fast." They moved fast. Samuel cut the morning rest period and pushed the convoy into a pace that the terrain barely allowed. The northern descent from the traverse was easier going than the ascent had been, but easier going on a mountain trail with wagons and exhausted cattle and families who'd spent the night on cold ground was still the kind of work that strips people down to what they're actually made of. Nobody complained. Colton noticed that and filed it somewhere. The specific texture of people who have decided something and are past the point of reconsidering it. Vivian drove their wagon through most of the descent, while Colton rode alongside, watching the tree line and the ridges above. Eli sat in the wagon bed wrapped in blankets, doing his letters in his primer with the focused dedication of a child who'd found something controllable in a situation that wasn't. Every hour or so, Vivian would call back to check something with him, a word, a sum, a small task. And the boy would answer, and that small regular exchange seemed to function as a kind of anchor for all 3 of them. By midday, the trees had changed. The pine gave way to stands of aspen whose white trunks caught the thin winter light, and the trail widened, and the air, though still cold, carried something different, less like granite, more like earth that still had moisture in it. Colton noticed it first. Then he saw Samuel, riding at the front, slow his horse and stand in the stirrups. "There," Samuel said, quietly. "Just that." The valley opened below them, like something a man wouldn't believe if he hadn't ridden 12 days through mountains to see it. It wasn't enormous, maybe 8 miles long, 4 across at its widest, but it sat in its bowl of surrounding ridgeline, with the contained self-sufficiency of a place that had been working fine on its own for a long time without needing anyone's approval. 2 creek lines were visible from the trail's edge, both running clear. The grass was winter dry but deep, the kind of deep that comes from seasons of growth without overgrazing. The southern wall of the valley blocked enough wind to make it sheltered. The northern end narrowed toward a second ridgeline that would take years to need worrying about. Colton looked at it for a while. He didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't be insufficient. Beside him, Eli had climbed up to the wagon bench and was looking with his mouth slightly open. He'd been looking at mountains and rock and dead trail grass for 12 days. "Is that where we're going?" he said. "That's where we're going," Vivian said. "It's green," the boy said, with the reverence of someone for whom green had recently become non-obvious. They were half a mile down the descent into the valley when the riders appeared. They came from the south end of the valley floor, the direction of the longer trail around the Callahan Range. Colton counted them fast. 12 men. Crow was in front, which was the first time he'd shown up personally since the night he'd come to the Hayes Ranch gate and said, all right, like closing a ledger. He must have ridden hard to get here. He looked it. His coat was trail dusty and his horse was not happy, and there was something in his bearing that was different from the controlled patience of his previous visits. He looked like a man who'd been outmaneuvered and hadn't accepted it yet. Samuel brought the convoy to a stop on the descent. Colton rode to the front. "This is it," Samuel said quietly, not to anyone in particular. Crow positioned his men across the valley entrance in a line that was intended to communicate that this was where the settlers stopped. He rode forward 20 yards from his line and waited. Samuel looked at Colton. Colton looked back. Then he rode forward to meet Crow, and Samuel came with him. Up close, in the flat winter light of the valley entrance, Jeremiah Crow looked his age in a way he hadn't when Colton had encountered him before. He was somewhere past 60, and 12 days of hard riding had collected in his face. He still had the pale eyes, the mustache, the fundamental quality of a man accustomed to being the largest force in any room. But something in the set of his jaw had the character of a man who'd already lost and was making himself keep going out of will alone. "You've made this very complicated," Crow said. "You started the complications," Samuel said. "I'm finishing them." Crow looked at the convoy on the trail behind them, the wagons, the cattle, the families. His expression was difficult to read. "Turn back. This is the last time I say that to anyone." "This land isn't claimed," Colton said. "No deed, no survey, no filing at any county seat. We have the same right to settle it you do." "You have no rights that I don't choose to give you," Crow said. It wasn't bluster. He believed it. That was the particular thing about Crow. He wasn't performing power. He'd simply organized his view of the world around the assumption that the powerful made the rules and everyone else navigated around them. He'd been right about that for long enough that the belief had become indistinguishable from fact in his mind. "You burned my storage building," Colton said. "You stole my cattle. You ran hired guns at us on a mountain traverse in the dark. You've spent 10 years crushing everyone in that valley who wouldn't bend to you." He kept his voice level. "And you're going to sit there on that horse and tell me about rights." Crow looked at him. "You should have taken the first offer," he said, "when I came to your gate. When you came to my gate, you told me to put a woman out of her home, so no." Something moved in Crow's face. Not regret, nothing that human, but a kind of tired recognition, maybe, that this was the shape the thing had taken, and there wasn't a clean version of it anymore. "Move your people out of my way," he said. "We're not in your way," Samuel said. "We're in no one's way. This valley has room for everyone who came here honestly. It does not have room for what you're proposing to do with it." Crow looked at Samuel for the first time with the focused attention he'd been directing at Colton. Something in his assessment shifted. "Mr. Wu," he said, "you've caused me more trouble than most." "I know," Samuel said. "I intend to keep doing it." Crow pulled his rifle from its scabbard. It happened in the particular compressed way that violence announces itself. Not sudden, but inevitable. The whole preceding conversation having been leading here the same way a river leads to a drop. Colton had his own rifle up before Crow's was level. Then something happened that Crow had not planned for. From behind the settler convoy, coming down the trail, sounds. Horses. Not many, but moving with the specific urgency of people who know where they're going. 4 riders came down from the tree line. Colton recognized 3 of them. Roy Harland, which was a genuine shock. The old man sat a horse, with the stiffness of someone who hadn't ridden hard in 20 years and had done it anyway. Nelson Aldrich, who'd sent the note saying he couldn't help with the fall cattle work. And a younger man Colton didn't immediately recognize, who was wearing a badge. The badge was County, not Sheriff Aldridge's Dry Creek badge. County. Roy pulled up alongside Colton with the breathing of a man who'd pushed too hard for too long and was ignoring it on principle. "Got word to the county seat 2 weeks ago," Roy said without preamble. "About the cattle theft, about Thomas Hale, about the boundary disputes and the water board." He was looking at Crow as he said it. "Took them a while. They came." The man with the badge, young, maybe 28, with the careful face of someone who understood that his next 10 minutes were going to matter, rode forward and positioned himself between the 2 groups. "Jeremiah Crow," he said. "I'm Deputy Marshal Calvin Reese from the Territorial Marshal's Office. I have a warrant for your detention pending investigation into cattle theft, property destruction, and potential charges relating to the death of Thomas Hale." He paused. "I'm going to ask you to put that rifle down. Crow didn't move for a long moment. His 12 men behind him shifted, looking at each other, looking at the badge, looking at the settlers on the trail above, doing private math about what this day was worth to them personally. One of them put his rifle across his saddle, barrel down. Not a dramatic gesture, just a man deciding. Then another. Crow watched it happen. Colton watched Crow watch it. The specific expression of a man understanding that the thing he'd built over decades was not as solid as he'd believed, because it had been built on fear, and fear turns out to have a melting point. When the fear runs out, so does the loyalty it was holding in place. By the time 3 more men had lowered their rifles, the arithmetic was clear. Crow lowered his own rifle. He looked at Colton with those pale eyes, and Colton looked back, and there was nothing particularly satisfying about the moment. This was what winning looked like when the winning had cost what this winning had cost. Not triumph, just the cessation of something that had been grinding everyone down for too long. "You've made yourself a hard road," Crow said, to Colton, to Samuel, to all of them. "Building something new is harder than you think." "Harder than what you put us through to get here?" Colton said. Crow didn't answer that. He handed his rifle to Deputy Marshal Reese with the deliberateness of a man who intends to make sure everyone registers what he's doing, and then sat very straight on his horse while his hands were bound and his remaining men decided, individually, quietly, that this was not the day they'd expected, and they were going to be elsewhere for the foreseeable future. Roy watched them scatter with the expression of a man who'd been waiting a long time to see exactly this. "Roy," Colton said, "you rode all the way up here." "I'm old, not dead," Roy said, "and I sent that letter 6 weeks ago, so don't give me too much credit." He looked at the valley opening below them, taking in the grass and the creek lines and the mountains on 3 sides. He was quiet for a moment. Margaret would have liked this. Colton felt that land. He breathed through it. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." They buried the first season in work so relentless and specific that it left no room for much else. That was both a necessity and a mercy. The 15 families built together first. One large communal structure that was objectively too crowded and not warm enough and smelled strongly of people who'd been working hard in close quarters, and was also the best winter any of them had spent in recent memory for reasons that had nothing to do with the building itself. Decisions got made collectively, which was slower and louder than one person deciding and occasionally produced outcomes that nobody had wanted but everyone could live with, which turned out to be a reasonable definition of community. Samuel organized the cattle operation with the same methodical patience he'd brought to everything else. Collective grazing management, shared labor on fencing and water infrastructure, a system of record-keeping that was scrupulously transparent because Samuel had seen what happened when records weren't. He was a natural administrator in the way that certain people are, not because they love administration, but because they understand that order is what allows everything else to happen. Fergus Doyle set up his smithy in a lean-to off the main structure within the first 2 weeks. The sound of his hammer became a kind of rhythm for the camp, early morning, mid-morning, after lunch, that told people where they were in the day. Ruth Doyle organized the food supply with an iron practicality that occasionally made people uncomfortable and kept everyone alive. She had opinions about rationing that she shared freely and implemented regardless of whether they'd been agreed to. And after the second month, nobody argued with her because she'd been right every time. Colton worked from before light until after dark, which was not new but was different now in a way he couldn't have explained precisely to anyone who asked. The work felt like building rather than surviving. Those are different things, even when they look the same from the outside. Vivian worked alongside him as often as she worked in the communal kitchen, which surprised some people and surprised nobody who'd watched her on the traverse. She had an instinct for what needed doing that didn't require being told, and she had the specific authority of someone who'd earned her place through demonstrated competence rather than claimed it through any other means. The other women gravitated toward her in the practical way that people gravitate toward someone who knows what she's doing. Clara Briggs, who'd lost her mother's dishes on the trail, spent 3 evenings that first month sitting with Vivian in the corner of the communal room. And Colton didn't know what they talked about, but Clara looked less hollowed out afterward. He and Vivian married in the deep of winter, in the communal room with everyone present because there was nowhere else to be, and nobody wanted to be elsewhere anyway. There was no ceremony in any formal sense. Deputy Marshal Reese had long since ridden back to the county seat with Crow in his custody, and the nearest person with official authority to do anything was 2 days' ride. Samuel said a few words because he was Samuel, and words in the right order were something he could do. Bill Garrett produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere he declined to specify, and Roy Harland, who'd stayed through the winter on the grounds that his trading post could manage without him and his nephew could mind the store, sat in the corner and looked satisfied in the way of old men who've been waiting to see something good happen and have finally seen it. Eli sat beside his father during whatever passed for the ceremony. And when it was over, he looked at Vivian with the thoughtful seriousness of a 7-year-old processing a significant development. "Are you my mother now?" he asked. Vivian looked at him. Colton held very still. "I'm Vivian," she said. "Same as I was this morning. But I'll be here, same as I was this morning." She paused. "Is that all right?" Eli considered it with the deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered. "My real mother was kind," he said. "Roy told me. And Papa says she was." "I believe that," Vivian said. She'd have wanted Papa to not be sad forever. The room had gotten very quiet, which 7-year-olds don't notice because they haven't learned yet to feel the weight of silence. "I think she would have," Vivian said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes weren't entirely dry. Eli nodded, settled, apparently satisfied with the accounting. "Okay," he said, and went to find Bill Garrett's whiskey, which he was not going to be allowed to have, but the trying was worth something. Colton looked at his wife across the small space between them. She looked back. There was nothing to say that the last several months hadn't already said, so he just took her hand. Bill Garrett poured the whiskey. Fergus Doyle's youngest daughter played 3 songs on a mouth organ nobody had known she owned. The fire in the communal hearth was big enough that the room was actually warm for once, and the sound of people talking and laughing in a confined space had the specific quality of people who know what silence and fear sound like and are choosing this instead. Spring broke the valley open in stages, first in the south-facing slopes where the snow pulled back earliest, then in the creek meadows, then eventually everywhere, the grass coming in with the particular determination of something that had been waiting a long time to grow. They built proper houses that spring, 1 per family, spread across the valley floor with space between them, but not too much space. The communal building became a meeting hall, which was Fergus's suggestion and turned out to be exactly right. They dug irrigation channels off the 2 creek lines. They planted. They expanded the cattle operation into the eastern meadow where the grass was deepest. Roy Harland went back to Dry Creek in April and returned in May with a wagon full of goods, and the information that Crow's operation, without Crow at its helm, was in a kind of slow dissolution. Foremen leaving, cattle being sold off to satisfy debts, the county taking a new look at several of the property transactions that had benefited from friendly judges and friendly water boards. The territory had sent an inspector. Things were changing. "What happened to the people in the valley?" Colton asked. "The ones Crow squeezed out. The Portis family?" "Ed Malloy." Roy shook his head. "Malloy sold and moved to Tucson. Portis went east. Some of them, I don't know." He paused. "You can't undo everything." "No," Colton said. That was a thing he sat with. The valley they'd escaped to was new and clean and theirs, but what had happened in Dry Creek had happened, and Thomas Hale was still dead, and the families who'd been broken before anyone organized to resist were still broken. Crow in custody and his operation dissolving didn't give those people their years back. That was the part of the story that didn't resolve neatly, and Colton was old enough and had lost enough to understand that the parts that don't resolve neatly are the truest parts. He told Vivian this one evening on the porch of their house, a real porch now, on a real house, with the valley spread out below them in the late spring light. "Thomas," she said. "You mean people like Thomas?" "All of them, the ones who didn't have a Samuel Wu, who didn't have 15 families, who just got ground down alone." She was quiet for a while. The creek ran below the ridge, visible from the porch, clear and purposeful. Eli's voice came from somewhere behind the house, arguing about something with Clara Briggs's son, which was his primary occupation these days now that there was another boy his age within shouting distance. "I used to think," Vivian said slowly, "that if I'd done something different, kept Thomas's records, gone to the county seat myself, made more noise, maybe it would have been different." She looked at the valley. "I know now that one person making noise would have just been one person getting quieter faster. The noise has to come from enough people at once to matter. We got lucky, Colton said, that Samuel was there, that he'd been building toward it. Yes, she said, and you were willing to be part of it. A lot of men wouldn't have been. A lot of men wouldn't have let you stay at their ranch in the first place. True. She glanced at him sideways. Why did you really? You gave me that answer about Eli on the porch that night, but he thought about it. Genuinely thought, not just reaching for the easy version. Because I'd been sleepwalking for 3 years, he said. And Eli pointed at you and said something true. And somewhere in me, I still recognized what true looked like, even when everything else was numb. He paused. Also, your predecessor in the kitchen left a lot to be desired. She laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it moved across the porch and out into the spring evening. And Colton thought, that's the sound of something healed. Not completely. She still went quiet sometimes with a look in her eyes that he understood was Thomas, was the 18 months of being pushed around a landscape like furniture, was things that don't finish healing just because the exterior circumstances have improved. He went quiet too sometimes, for his own reasons. Imperfect people, healing imperfectly, building something real anyway. That was the most honest version of it. By the second summer, the settlement had a name. Creek's End, which was Ruth Doyle's suggestion on the grounds that it was where they'd stopped running and started being somewhere. By the third year, it had a proper school, which Vivian ran because she was the most qualified person available and because she'd been educating Eli for 2 years already and had figured out what worked and what didn't. By the fourth year, there were families in the valley who hadn't made the original crossing, people who'd heard about the settlement and come looking, some of them from Dry Creek itself, some from further. Samuel, by that point, had established something that looked like a local governance structure. Nothing official, nothing with a formal name, just a set of agreements about how decisions got made and how disputes got handled, and what the community owed each other and what it didn't. It wasn't perfect. It had arguments, and it had people who pushed against it, and it had the ordinary friction of human beings trying to live near each other. That was fine. That was, in fact, the point. A place where nobody could make themselves unaccountable to everyone else was the point. Deputy Marshal Reese came back the following spring, not on official business. Crow's case had been dealt with at the territorial level, resulting in a sentence that Reese described as substantial without elaborating. But out of what he admitted was personal curiosity about what they'd built. He stayed 3 days and left looking thoughtful. I've been to a lot of settlements, he told Colton the morning he rode out. Most of them fall apart within 5 years. Internal disputes, bad winters, people giving up. What makes the difference? Colton asked. Reese thought about it. Whether people think they built it together or whether they think someone built it for them, he said. The ones that last are the ones where the building was collective, where everyone has skin in it. After he left, Colton stood at the edge of the ridge where the trail came down from the mountains. The same spot where he'd first seen the valley, that December morning that felt much longer ago than it was, and looked at what they'd made. Houses spread along the creek. Cattle in the eastern meadow. The school building, which had a slightly uneven roofline because Bill Garrett had been in charge of the beams, and Bill Garrett's carpentry was enthusiastic rather than precise. The sound of Fergus's hammer, children in the distance, too many to count. Eli came up beside him, the way he did sometimes when he found his father standing somewhere looking at something. The boy was 8 now, taller, with the beginning of a serious expression that lived on his face more often than it used to. He'd have his father's build eventually. He had his mother's eyes, which was something Colton had learned to look at without it costing him everything every time. What are you thinking about? Eli asked. Colton looked at the valley, at the creek, at the houses, at the specific ordinary morning of a place that was alive. About that bench in Dry Creek, he said. Outside Harlan's trading post. Eli thought. Where Vivian was sitting? Where you told me she looked lonely. Eli looked at the valley too, with the serious expression. Was I right? Yes, Colton said. You were right. The boy seemed to find this satisfactory. He stood beside his father for another moment, then spotted something interesting in the direction of the creek and went toward it at the loping run of a child who has somewhere to be. Vivian appeared from the house behind them. She'd heard enough of the exchange from the open door. She came and stood where Eli had been standing, and she and Colton looked at the valley together in the morning light. Her hand found his. He held it. There were things that had been lost that weren't coming back. There were people who'd been hurt before anyone had figured out how to stop it. There were marks on both of them that didn't fade just because the story had found its way somewhere worth going. That was the truth of it, and Colton had lived enough to know that the truth of it mattered more than a cleaner version would. But the creek ran. The grass grew. The children were loud. The school had an uneven roofline, and inside it a woman who'd been told for years she had no right to take up space was teaching other people's children how to read, which was its own kind of answer to everything that had tried to make her smaller. A 6-year-old boy had looked at a lonely woman on a bench and said the thing out loud that everyone else had walked past. And one tired, half-hollow man had been awake enough, barely, to hear it. That was where it started. Nowhere more dramatic than that. A child with honest eyes and a father who still had just enough left in him to respond to an honest thing when he heard one. The rest, they had built together. And it held.